All right, thank you. Well, welcome, everyone. We will go ahead and call to order our Carbondale Tree Board meeting today, July 20th, and we are now in session. And
Roll call.
okay, roll call, please. Dan?
Here.
Carrie?
Here. Joanne.
Lisa? And I don't think we have Sky on tonight. Okay.
All right. I'd like to make a motion that we dispense with the reading of the previous meeting's minutes and proceed into the presentation so that we don't lose any time.
Right. So we have a motion on the floor to dispense with our minutes approval and go right to our presentation. Do we have a second for that?
Second.
All right, we have a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please?
Right.
Aye. All right. And our first presenter on this is our town arborist, Carl.
Hello, everybody. Just give me a moment. I'll get it set up here.
I'll go there. Nope, that's not it. Try the one. There you go.
Would it just be noted that the town manager, Lauren, is on Zoom, okay?
Okay, wait, hold on. That was mine.
Okay, so then just go to stop sharing. There you go.
Yeah.
The other one is still coming up. So you need to stop sharing. So stop sharing. Minimize. Okay. And then, okay, so let's start it over. So click on share screen and then do window and make sure you have yours up.
I can pick it out.
Okay. Yeah.
I can find it in there.
Well, it's just gonna share that document.
Okay.
So are they all
Yeah, it's
Okay.
there. But
coming up? Okay, so you're gonna have to go back here. And now call it up, whichever one is yours. Go ahead and open it, so. Okay, and then come back here. And then.
there it is.
Okay, and then-
Okay, we got it. So as everyone knows, emerald ash borer was found in town in mid-June. So it's big news. You can see, it was covered by the Denver Post, did a big article about it. And this is a big deal for trees in Carbondale. So, today I'm here the goals of the meeting today, provide information about EAB for various boards, commissions, the public and surrounding communities. Provide opportunities for Q&A after the presentation. So after the three of us do our presentations, we'll have opportunities for Q&A. Presenters will include myself. I'm the town arborist in Carbondale. We have Melissa Schreiner, entomologist, CSU Extension, and Chris Beiser, the town arborist in Basalt. And future meetings will focus on reviewing recommendations from various boards, commissions, and the public, landing on a management plan that meets our community's values, a presentation of proposed EAB management plan to the Board of Trustees, and then having the trustees approve the plan. So that's kind of the process that we're going through. Also, just to let everyone know, there's screens you can check out. The presentation is also a big screen over there, so for viewing. Okay, so initial detection. So this photo in the middle when I worked for the city of Longmont, in 2013, EAB had been discovered in Boulder County. So Longmont is close to Boulder. So we were doing all kinds of sampling in Longmont, cutting branches out and just peeling away. And this is kind of a funny stage photo that we did because we were just peeling so many branches, right? We never actually found any EAB larvae. We found a lot of lilac ash borer, but we never actually found it. When I left around 2016, it had just been discovered in Longmont. This photo on the right is a really cool one from one of our tree contractors, Wes. And this was probably late June. This was off of a private tree. And this is an adult. And it looks like it's going to fire out of there like a cannon, but I think in actuality, it was just kind of peeking out, but kind of a cool photo. So just I'll kind of just get the meeting going and tell you, how it was identified and some things for us to think about before other presenters. But so the first area that I saw it was Dan from the tree board alerted me to trees in front of the post office. He said, hey, there might be EAB over there. You ought to check it out. And I was like, okay, whatever. And he's like, no, you really ought to check it out. So I was like, okay, I'll check it out. So I go over there, and there's 4 dead trees in front of the post office. And I'm looking at them like, okay, they're dead. And I see a D-shaped exit hole. So I was like, I remember that from Longmont. That could be EAB. But maybe I'm just seeing things. Really suspicious. So then I go to area 2. So last year, I've been a town arborist about a year and a half. So last summer, I kind of just did a big assessment. So I could kind of generally know what's going on and where I need to steer my budget and what kind of work to do. And I remember last year I noticed some ash trees along Village Road that had, about 30% dieback in the canopy. So I was like, I ought to go check those out. So I actually climbed up into one of those trees. And this year it showed a lot of decline, like 75% is dead now. So I'm like, ooh, this is not good. So I took a sample and I found more D-shaped holes. And then I also found S-shaped galleries. And that's when I was like, ooh, this is not good. And this started just this chain of communications. I actually called Chris Beiser to come look at it because he has a lot of experience. And I got a hold of the state and this whole chain of events that happened. And that picture below is actually from that first sample, which I have that sample on a table over here. If anybody wants to look at it and see it in person after the meeting. Just some more pictures, Wes's picture again. This is one from when the state was here. So the state happened to be up Valley. They came down and positively identified it with their crews, Dan West and Cami Long. So there's an adult that's still under the bark that hadn't emerged yet. This is like June 16th. And then you can see the little larvae there. And then they're pulling them out. So you can see one there in the hand. So chain of events initially detected on June 15th, confirmed on June 16th by Colorado State University. The state, they have to confirm it to say that it's here for sure. It has to go back to a lab there, I think in Fort Collins. We did a press release on June 20th. So when this is coming about, I'm like, hey, this is a big deal. I'm going to need some help. I need to communicate. So I initiated the creation of the Roaring Fork and Beyond EAB group. And we had our first meeting via Zoom on June 29th. And this group is made up of other town arborists in the Valley, local tree companies, and also came along from the state. And we kind of had some key initial actions that we all agreed upon. And these are like common things. So we said right away, okay, we want to promote nobody transporting any firewood that's infected. And it's just a good practice to burn and collect on site when for firewood in general. And then you're just not spreading anything because it could be other stuff too, right? And then we said, okay, we want to limit movement of infected material between May and August. And that's because between May and August, that's when the bug is active, right? Coming out, feeding, mating, trying to lay eggs, right? So we're saying, let's not move any infected material during this time. And then another thing we had to say, okay, where are we going to take infected material at the proper time? So we said, okay, South Canyon is a designated point, and then Pitkin County landfill. So those are big things as part of this process too. It's just where to dump the material and process it further so it won't spread more. And then we said, okay, anyone that suspects they see EAB, report it to your municipal local arborist and for further inspection or whatnot. So current actions that I'm working on, creating a map of infected areas to be available to the public. Also creating a more specific map for tree professionals as it moves from public and private properties. So we can communicate, in the beginning, this is really important. I think as it spreads further, we may, it may not be as important, but in the beginning, it's really important to know where it is. And one thing I'm doing right now, and probably other towns too, is gathering data on their public ash trees. So like the diameter, the general condition, treatability, presence of EAB, and the declaration as a high value ash. And then, of course, creating opportunities for boards, commissions, the public to learn, ask questions, and provide input into the management plan here in Carbondale, which I'm working on. Some other current actions. So together, the Roaring Fork group, Chris was a big part of this, and Heather created this really nice trifold informational pamphlet, which we have available over here, which has been awesome. Yeah, and just really trying to come up with a plan that reflects our values here in Carbondale. And the town has been willing to purchase me a chipper, which is great. That'll help me process certain sizes of material, which is awesome. So just ash trees and Carbondale public spaces. So it's roughly 10% of our public tree canopy, which is about 400 trees. I'm still working on updating this. The last inventory was done in 2010, so it's not completely accurate. I'm hoping in the next week or two, I'll have that all updated and can use that to crunch numbers for management plans, costs, and things like that. So park trees, trees in the right of way, street trees. Something to note here in Carbondale, there are some areas that are more densely populated by ash trees. So right downtown, Main and Fourth in the plaza, it's really densely planted there. So we're going to have a tight lens there and what's our future vision, like long term. And also in River Valley Ranch in the right of way, there's stretches where, 10, 15, 20, just really densely planted. Again, we're going to have to really look in the long term. What do we want looks, the cost and kind of spread things out. So this is just to preface some of the other information. I want to talk about this topic. What is a high value ash tree? Because this is important at this point. Now, you can say generally that all trees throughout their entire life cycle provide value, right? Through their life and their death, decomposition, right? Of course. However, the complex interaction of ash trees in our urban environment, plus the emergence of EAB, forces us to make declarations about the value of ash trees. Therefore, characteristics of a high value ash tree must be agreed upon when deciding what specific trees to focus management on. Trees that are not treated will eventually die from EAB over a period of 2 to 4 years, probably depending on how good the site is, the health of the tree, things like that. So one of the unfortunate things about EAB is it makes us make these decisions, whether we're going to treat or not treat. There might be a very small percentage that could survive, from an infestation. They probably know a little bit more data, but I don't think it's a very high percent, unfortunately. So let's go into some characteristics. Okay. Of a high value ash tree. So good condition, vigorously growing, good overall structure. It's receiving consistent irrigation, enhances the landscape, valuable to the owner. Location and size of tree favorable for treatment options. This is important because you may have some trees that you really value, but because of the location and the size of the tree, the type of treatment may not align with our values, right? Insecticides and things like that. No large trunk wounds from mowers, weed whackers, or vehicles. This is important because you need intact bark for the injections to go up through the tree. And there may be some different data on this, but some say that, you know, you need at least 60% live crown and no more than 40% affected by EAB for it to take a treatment. You know, some may say 50%. It probably depends on the site of the tree, things like that. Not high value characteristics. Okay, unhealthy, not vigorously growing each year. Unfavorable tree structure. Planted in poor sites or not as important to the landscape, causing sightline or public safety issues. Believe me, like there's a lot of this that happens when you work in the public sector, things growing up and blocking, you know, views, like it can be a big issue. Don't receive consistent irrigation, suppressed by surrounding trees, or maybe it's just showing a lot of signs of EAB or other bugs, lilac ash borer, ash bark beetle. Maybe it's already being hit by other stuff. And it has large trunk wounds present and more than 40% crown affected by EAB. So I took some pictures, some examples of trees in town we may be familiar with. So this is a tree in Cypress Park. I'm asking myself, is this a high value tree? Good condition, consistent irrigation, enhances the landscape, valuable to Cypress Park. No signs of EAB yet. It's just down the street, but I don't see big sign, I don't see signs yet. I would say, yes, this is high value. I would probably say we want to treat that tree. Here's another tree. It's a little bit hard to see, but kind of towards the right, you can see it in the middle, it's kind of leaning. So we look at this, I say, well, the structure is less favorable here, right? So we have two stems coming up in the middle that are leaning and they're similar size. They call that co-dominant. And structurally, that's not ideal in the tree world, right? You down where the crevice is, kind of that, it can cause included bark. It's just not as favorable structurally. That tree's not going to fall over today, but not favorable in the long term. But it does have irrigation, but it's being suppressed on the left. So there's some big Siberian elms, you know, it's been suppressed over the years. I believe it was planted thinking maybe some of the other trees would be removed. You know, sometimes this happens, but anyhow, this is how it is now. No signs of EAB yet, but I would say for the long term, we're not going to put our money into this tree, right? So I'm going to call it not high value. I would decide to not treat this. Another example, this is a street tree. It's actually not a public tree, but it's a street tree. So we have 60% live crown and no more than 40% affected by EAB. It's like, okay, all right. So some of the signs you can see there, dying back from the tip, and you can kind of see a little bit of small leaves kind of starting on the other lead. I say, high value. Well, I look down, look at where it's growing. Poor site, right? There's not a lot of root space there for that tree to grow. It's likely not getting good irrigation, consistent irrigation, you know, and you need water for the chemicals to uptake. So I'm just going to say, no, we're not going to put our money into a tree like that. And you know, these are just some other general issues that we have for street trees in general. And these are some other ash trees. These are public trees. You can see the one on the left. It's just been generally declining for probably multiple years. It doesn't have EAB, but it's just kind of generally declining. The one in the middle, you can actually see the grate. You know, it should have been cut away at some point, but it hasn't. And this is common. This happens a lot for street trees all over the place. But now it's actually kind of slowly girdling the tree. And so that's an issue. And then the one on the right, it has leaf scorch, which is probably due to irrigation. I'm not sure if it could be a really early sign of EAB, but probably due to irrigation. And, you know, we already know in general in downtown, our other linden trees also struggle because of irrigation, likely kind of irrigation issues and just, you know, where they grow. So, you know, our downtown street trees in general, we need to look in the future and kind of think, what do we want this to look like, long term, and do some planning for that. Just some aspects for us to consider as we're learning more. What trees to focus management on? Are all trees treatable? Cost of various management actions, risk of using insecticides, short versus long-term management, EAB's effect on Carbondale and the surrounding communities. Like, we're all in this together in the valley. What have other towns done? What do we know is effective management? Can we stop EAB? And what can homeowners do to help? So just some things to kind of get us going. So now we'll get up the other presenters here. Chris will be next.
Stop sharing.
Or Melissa.
Thank you, Carl. And this is Melissa Schreiner. She is the Colorado State University Extension Entomologist.
She'll wanna queue up.
Let's see. So I think that's hers. Yeah.
23. Thank you, Carl, and thanks to the board for inviting me here to speak about the emerald ash borer. It's bad news, unfortunately, that it's here. My name is Melissa Schreiner. I serve as the extension entomologist. I've been at CSU in one capacity or another for about 12 years. This is my information. I'll show it again at the end. Feel free to contact me with insect issues. I work outside of my area. I'm mainly stationed in Mesa, Delta, Montrose, and Uray counties, but being the only extension entomologist in the state, I really try to work out of area across Western Colorado to help support issues. So please don't hesitate to reach out. I want to briefly go over ash ID. You can look for that diamond pattern, grayish bark, whitish almost, the really cute Hershey Kiss buds, the compound leaves, opposite branching, and those canoe paddle-shaped samaras that you'll see. These are just some tips for how to ID ash. Both green and white ash are dioecious, so they have male and female plants that are separate. So they need, for the most part, to set seed, both of them to be in the environment. But most of the trees planted in Colorado, their ash are males. Here's a picture of a female, which is seed bearing, and those males are pollen producing. On the left side is a female, on the right side is a male ash. And I want to credit some of these following slides to the emerald ash borer guru on the East Coast. His name is Dr. Nathan Seigrit, Nate. He's a wonderful entomologist. So a lot of these slides I helped to build from his expertise and his resources. You can see the emerald ash borer. I believe Chris does have a sample that he'll likely share. They're quite small on the screen. It's very much enlarged. It's really considered the most destructive forest pest in Eastern North America, if not Northern America. It's killed millions of our native Northern American ash. And it's really transported by humans through firewood, of course, and timber, nursery stock. In its native range in Asia, it's not a problem. It's because it's been moved here. It now has a new environment. There aren't pathogens. There's not predators constantly keeping it in check. It wasn't even really known about in Asia until it came to, very little was known until it arrived on the North American continent. Host susceptibility, I really want to touch on this. It's been shown in a lot of research that our Northern American ash species are more susceptible to EAB than ash that occur in Asia. And that's very unfortunate for us here in Northern America, especially on the East Coast where we have native ash forests. Here in the Western US, we only have ash planted as pretty much as in our urban tree canopy across cities and in urban spaces. But to touch on the biology and the life cycle, they're only about a ½ inch long, and it generally takes 1 year to complete a life cycle. It can be 2-year development depending in newly established sites. So it's possible we'll see that here, not really sure.
Yeah, more rapid development at high EAB densities, of course. So where we have lots of ash and lots of trees that are impacted by this pest, it's going to spread more rapidly. That serpentine tunneling of that larvae is distinctive. They begin feeding. This is probably eastern coast stuff. I think it could vary here a little bit, but in July, and they mostly finish by October and November. These extensive galleries cut off the piping system of the tree, the cambial layer. They can't pipe down photosynthase throughout the tree body and water upwards and nutrients. It's unfortunately cutting off all of the flow of the cambium, and it eventually chokes out the tree's ability to survive. It can't move anything around that it needs to live. So these larvae are responsible for that. And I think in the community, especially arborists, when we're looking at tree decline and mortality, the foliage really begins to thin. It's ragged, it's yellow. There's significant canopy dieback. As Carl mentioned, it can be very rapid. And it can be anywhere from 2 to 4 years, 3 to 5 years that you can lose an ash that's untreated. It's typically that all ash that have EAB, pretty much just statistically, they pretty much die. Very little survive. Of course, these larval injuries cause the tree death if they're not treated. So we do have good insecticidal tools in our toolbox to treat this insect. There's a lot of work that's gone into this. I have printed some of these additions. They're the insecticide options for protecting ash trees. This is a multi-university collaboration. They're printed over here on the table. I tried to print enough copies for folks interested. It's a wonderful, very detailed guide. Luckily, in some regard, we're lucky because this has been studied in other areas, and of course, we're unlucky because it's finally here. But I do want to point out some of the insecticides and the ways that they're applied. You can do bark sprays to protect against egg laying and early instar larvae, broad spectrum sprays. You can do soil injections, and then of course trunk injections. And it's emamectin benzoate, the one second down from the bottom. That's really, it's a wonderful tool. It's a 2-year treatment. It is expensive to apply, but that tree is protected for 2 years if you apply emamectin benzoate. And there has been a lot of those are the two that are the trunk injections. It's like giving a tree a shot instead of just watering in a chemical where it would be taken up by the roots. It's given a shot, pressure injected, and that uptakes into the tree. And it does need to have irrigation, of course, to move those chemicals upward into the tree body, and it protects it. So if eggs are laid on that tree, and even if they hatch and larvae are starting to bore in, they're going to cease to exist after a matter of time if that chemical is there. Hopefully my other text shows up. Okay, yes, I'm going to put those up there quickly. I've worked actually very limitedly with EAB. I was very lucky to work on this project in graduate school where emamectin benzoate was looked at and this individual, Dr. Rasha Khalil, she studied pollen and she looked at ash pollen, and she was actually able to conclude that by honeybees foraging pollen, she took their scopal pollen pods and she analyzed them for presence of emamectin benzoate. She wanted to see, are European honeybees interacting with ash early in the spring? Are they foraging on those ash flowers? That's a big question, because if we mass treat our ash trees with emamectin benzoate, is that going to be a product that ends up in beehives? And her work is a wonderful summary. She found very little emamectin benzoate in pollen, which I think is a surprise to many of us. I had worked on this project as a tech, and I actually, doing this presentation, I found her published paper and read her results. And ash pollen was a minor source of pollen collected by honeybees throughout her dissertation, a 4-year study in Boulder County. Pollen from white ash was collected much less commonly than green. Interesting to note. A reduction in collection of pollen from ash trees can be reduced by increasing the use of other pollen sources during ash bloom, maple trees. There's lots of other trees in the environment that are highly attractive to honeybees that are likely where they're mainly spending their time in the spring. So I just felt that was very interesting to share, because I think a lot of us are worried about protecting pollinators, and I feel emamectin benzoate is a wonderful tool to use, backed by this research project. Across the state, those 2 new red stars they're not good. In Littleton, they were able to take genetics. They actually identified pupae, and they were able to, in Fort Collins, they were able to show that it was emerald ash borer. And then of course, here in Carbondale, Carl's told that story tonight. Our state forest entomologist, Dan West with the Colorado State Forest Service, has said he's surprised it's taken this long to find new detections. A lot of it is just eyes looking out in the community. I want to thank all of you tonight for being here. Community meetings are an important place to be. I know it's a busy time of year. One thing that's really challenging about this pest is, and being located in Colorado, when insects from out of the country arrive in port areas like the Western coast and the Eastern coast, that's where the federal money goes. And then eventually things start to end up coming to Colorado. And there was a quarantine, even statewide, there was a quarantine in the state, and that has since been dropped. It's very expensive to run this program statewide by the Department of Agriculture. And that's to one reason or another, it's less regulated, and maybe that's why firewood has been moved. It's all part of it, I suppose. But promoting IPM is really important in the landscape. We can all be out there identifying and trying to manage and reduce risks. All of our observations are really important. I know very little about the biocontrol. I know APHIS does work with some of the biology from the native range in Asia in terms of how that could be potentially released here. But in Colorado, our lack of relative humidity makes biocontrol work really challenging. Not that it's impossible, but I suppose maybe more to come from Chris on that. I'm not sure. But what to look for in the community? This blonding from woodpeckers. Woodpeckers will eat those larvae in the trees, and that will strip the bark of the tree. That can change the appearance. These epicormic sprouts that come off of the tree, significant dieback, especially high up in the crown, and the bark splitting can be a sign of emerald ash borer. If you think you have EAB, I really want to highlight that I am a resource. I'm certified to identify emerald ash borer. I also would back it with an identification off main campus, but I'm a resource. My email is here. Just send me an email and I can tell you how to reach me and send your sample in. But I try to come up with a step-by-step process. You want to attempt to get photos and samples. You want to make contact to me or to State Forest Service. Dr. Amy Hauber is here today, our Garfield County Extension agent. She's a specialist. She is our agriculture and natural resource agent. So you could even potentially reach out to her and say, hey, that talk that entomologist gave, let's send her a sample. So Amy is a resource to you locally here in Garfield County, but please feel free to email me directly, either or. I want to point out that we have other buprestids in the state. I even left off a few others. I probably shouldn't. Other agrylus species, but we have other wood borers that the community will see and will be panicked by, even other insects. People see insects very differently and there'll be a lot of panic. So always feel free to reach out to Extension if you want an insect identified. I love to do that. So please reach out. The Colorado State Forest Service website is a phenomenal pool of resources. I highly recommend heading that way if you feel you want to learn more about this and spread resources to others. So thank you again. Here's my information, and thank you for the time to present tonight.
Thank you, Melissa. Chris Beiser from Town of Basalt, Arborist, is up next.
All right, like they said, thank you, Carl, Melissa. I'm Chris Beiser. I'm the arborist with Town of Basalt. I am here because I have quite a bit of professional experience with this insect. I previously was actually in the Midwest for the majority of my career, moved out here just a few years ago. I started in the industry actually in Lansing, Michigan with Michigan State University. We were there at ground zero when it showed up. By the time I showed up in college, it was all anybody talked about. I mean, it was literally the only thing I learned in entomology class. And then I moved to Traverse City where I did field research, mostly in orchards, but also helping to identify outbreaks as they spread across the state. I moved back to my native city of Chicago after that, working for the Chicago Botanic Garden. At that point, they had already seen emerald ash borer show up, and they were in year 2 of implementing their 10+ year strategy. During my 4 years there, I saw the removal of over half their ash tree collection, every species, every cultivar. I really can't emphasize that enough. This is not something that you can think your tree is going to be spared. I helped to, again, kind of titrate in our long-term plan there, adjusting as we saw how this insect was spreading, as well as then, picking we always call ourselves the Noah's Ark of ash trees in Chicago, being a botanic garden. In 2018, I moved to the private industry as a plant health manager. So I was the guy managing the tree collections, sending the technicians out to do these treatments. They are not straightforward treatments. They are very doable by a tree care company, but they do require some level of training, which we'll get to. And then 2020 with the pandemic, I set sail out west, moved here, was having a tour with my boss. And my first question was, there's a lot of ash trees here, a lot of young ash trees. Do you guys have emerald ash borer? And he just responded, what's emerald ash borer? And here we are 3 years later, sure enough, it's shown up. So I want to reiterate, EAB is an extremely serious pest, probably the most serious that we will deal with in our lifetimes, hopefully, because I don't want to deal with another bad one like this. Effectively, 100% of ash trees do have some level of susceptibility to mortality, meaning death from EAB. We do have some advantages here being in the Roaring Fork Valley because we are not in the native range of the North American ash collections. So about roughly 99% of ash trees, I'd say here, are all in managed landscapes, meaning we have eyes on them. They're all being very well cared for. That is very different from places like Chicago, where roughly 30% of their native woodlands were ash tree when this all outbroke. That created a big problem because you have these huge banks of untreated ashes because you just can't physically manage that many trees for treatments. We had a hard enough time just removing them for hazard removal over the years. There has been some genetic resistance found in those native populations. It's worth noting that 10, 20, 30 years down the road, we may very well see new cultivars appearing in the market for ash tree that are highly resistant to this insect, similar like what we're seeing with the reintroduction of the American elm tree as these new hybrid cultivars come out. But at the moment, there really is no genetic resistance locally. Because of the way that tree nurseries work, how we can replicate the exact same tree over and over again, it makes just about every one of our ash trees here, being managed landscape ash trees, they are genetically identical. So to think that your ash tree is special and somehow is genetically more resistant, it would be true if it was native, but because you purchased it at a landscape, which is what everybody does, that's how you can get a guaranteed tree for what you buy. It is most certainly susceptible. On top of that, the majority of our ash trees here are green or white ash, which are the most susceptible species. There is some less common species I've seen around the valley, some Korean ashes, some Manchurians that have slightly more tolerance, but generally speaking, we are not dealing with those here. So if you have an ash tree, you should assume that you are under threat from this insect. I do always like to point out, because I always get this question, what about my mountain ash? Other than the common name, those two trees have nothing to do with each other. So ash trees in Fraxinus in the Olaceae family have nothing to do with genetically with mountain ash, which is a sorbus genus. And they're very different if you were to look at two side by side. So if you have a tree that's got lovely orange berries on it and nice, lovely, slightly flaking bark, you've got a mountain ash and you've made the right choice when you planted that tree. We all love ash trees, but again, we've kind of just been pushed up against the wall with the fact that we can't plant them anymore. And in fact, they are no longer really sold at nurseries anywhere since this was introduced into the United States. So just to give you kind of an outlook on what we can expect for spread of EAB in the community, once it's introduced, which we have it in Carbondale, it does move rapidly, historically speaking. So we're basing this all on what we've seen in the past, how it's moved through the last 2 decades through the country. A big difference, we do have some big differences that lead to some advantages for us. The biggest difference being that they don't exist natively, ash trees in our valley. So for the most part, we have pockets of large ash tree populations, mostly circling around our urban centers, as well as our large residential and commercial areas where we have very large, purposefully planted landscapes. This does give us a little bit of an opportunity to potentially reduce this initial wave as it moves through, because again, we can create these little pockets of well-treated trees that everybody's got eyes on. And we can have that really good communication where we don't have to worry so much about this outside source from native areas, reintroducing EAB over and over and over again to our landscapes. In effect, EAB will have to do essentially a leapfrog to be able to move from community to community. But most likely that will happen. I mean, we can't predict the future, but based on literally everything we've seen in North America so far, it will happen. It's just a matter of time. Major places that we should expect it to pop up initially, we'll probably have our biggest outbreaks in the big 4 towns and cities in the valley: Glenwood Springs, Carbondale, where it's already identified, Basalt and Aspen. But we should also be looking out for minor outbreaks in some of these larger communities, some of our country clubs, our larger neighborhoods, such as Blue Lake, Aspen Glen, River Valley Ranch, et cetera. At the end of the day, this insect can travel up to 30 miles to find a new host tree. Typically, it's a little bit shorter than that, but that does drive home the point that this thing can move from one end of the valley to the other in one season. So what are we working on, and what should we be striving for in our valley? We should be pushing for collaboration between communities, because that's honestly the biggest thing here. If we can all get on the same page and be fighting the same fight and singing the same song, we can create effective policies. We've already been working together. Carl alluded to that in his presentation, to create some minimum standards just to get us started. We've seen this as a problem in larger urban areas where towns that are literally next to each other, that are only a difference in space by, a political map or a town line that was drawn, have totally differing policies. They don't talk to each other. They have totally different resources. And then at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if you do a really great job in your town. If the town next door doesn't, again, you've got that source just constantly pouring into the other side of town. We have the advantage here where, one, we're a very tight-knit community. I think I speak for everybody when everybody in this valley tends to work together on these big picture problems. So we have that working for us. And I highly encourage us to continue down that path, both in sharing of educational resources, which we've already done with making some flyers, holding some public outreach events to get started, and expanding our communication bandwidth, because we really do just need to get the word out. If you have an ash tree, at minimum, you need to be keeping an eye on it and report anything suspicious. We do also want to recommend shared policies. Carl alluded on these, some firewood movement bans. It was a Colorado quarantine, but as Melissa mentioned, they have since pulled that. So now it's more of a recommendation and best practices. We would be considered a quarantine area if that was still the case. We are enacting a ban throughout the valley of moving infested chips and logs up and down valley, mostly for the purpose of disposal between the months of May through August, which is an identified flying period for the adults, because we don't want to accidentally move an infested tree all the way up valley and just dropping off EAB everywhere we go, because that would be a disaster. Something we will be challenged with is we do have a lot of unincorporated and rural areas that don't necessarily have a full body government and community to really help bring these sorts of ideas together. So it's really on all of us to reach out to those communities and make sure that they're informed and getting this word out. For myself, I've been reaching out to the property managers that manage all of Elgibel, as well as doing identifications in neighboring communities like Blue Lake, because at the end of the day, if Elgibel gets emerald ash borer, it's my problem because it's 500 yards away. Even if they don't have a government or any sort of resource that can really tackle that problem, I need to proactively help them with that, to help Basalt and to help the rest of our valley. The role of the private industry is also cannot be understated. It's robust, it's full of knowledgeable arborists. I've been in and out of that industry my entire life. And frankly, there are eyes and our ears in the field. We need to use them to help communicate shared policies, outbreaks, and management strategies. And because frankly, most homeowners don't call your local municipal arborist or your extension officer because they just don't know those resources exist. They call the guy that cut their tree down 2 years ago that they always call when they've got some funky thing going on with their yard. So we need to lean on the private industry to be our eyes and ears in the field and to be helping us report these suspicious trees when we find them. We're also talking about defining a preferred list of tree care companies because I get a question a lot of times like, who do I call? Who's the right company to call? As a town employee, I can't necessarily favor one company over the other. So we're going to work on creating a list where if the company meets minimum requirements such as ISA arborist certifications, having your CPO and QS license from the state, meaning you are legally allowed to use pesticides and apply them, as well as getting training from the manufacturing company to use those trunk injection systems. Those will be things that allow us to be able to add your name to recommend you as a quality company that won't come in and questionably do things weird with your tree. I also tend to see with this, whenever EAB moves in, we get what's called the gold rush of EAB companies. It's not all bad. It's actually great in some respects because we get a lot of new knowledge, a lot of new resources for people moving in. But we also get the Joes next door that have, you know, the chainsaw in their shed and they're like, I can take care of that tree for you. No, you can't. Make sure that you're vetting the company that you're having to come out and treat and or remove your ash tree. The biggest line I always get when I call, you know, my old manager at the Botanic Garden is don't let this insect manage you. He felt like for the last 10 years, every year he was just 1 year behind what he should have been doing the previous year. So now we have that window of opportunity right now to get on top of this. And the best way we can reduce the initial impact and spread is through preventative treatment. All homeowners that have an ash tree in their yard, whether they intend to treat it tomorrow or not, should have a plan in place, especially when you hear that it's in your neighboring town. You know, I'm not necessarily telling everybody in Basalt to run out and hire a tree care company to start treating it tomorrow, because it's not necessarily within our immediate range and in our immediate concern. But I am telling them, have that phone number on speed dial and be ready to start that treatment the day that you hear the PSA that it's entered Basalt. Don't wait for symptoms to show up in your neighborhood before discussing strategy. It especially applies to people who are on HOAs. Those are going to be the fights that you need to have now so that when the time comes to make those decisions to treat or remove trees, you've already got a plan in place. A lot of numbers get thrown around. Carl mentioned about anywhere from 40 to 60% dieback. A lot of trees can actually be brought back from the cliff of death, so to speak. That tree will never be the same. Dead limbs don't magically regrow leaves. It will be permanently deformed. So I always say, honestly, if it's a high value tree and you've got more than 30% dieback, you're never going to like that tree the way that it was when it was fully healthy. So make sure that if you have a high value tree in your yard, that I would argue those are the ones that we should start preventatively treating right now. And for those that are, again, HOAs dealing with larger tree collections, we really need to talk about a long-term plan, not just what we're doing tomorrow or next year. We need to be ready for dead trees because inevitably a lot of these ash trees are going to die, whether from late treatment, ineffective treatment, or just simply because we decided not to treat them. HOAs and municipalities are going to need to consider ordinances that help and or require the removal of these infested trees, because if that tree dies, it doesn't mean the insect magically disappears. It actually becomes a source for that insect, for everybody around you for the next several years while that tree truly just falls apart into nothing. The other big thing is that those trees, when they die, become extremely brittle and dangerous. They become hazardous trees. They become much more difficult to remove. They become more expensive to remove. So again, another reason that you really should be vetting whatever tree care company you're working with. So with any of these management plans, the real goal at the end of the day is managing our pest pressure, managing just how much EAB is out there. I teach a lot of plant healthcare classes in Chicago still, and I always teach that eradication of pests is an unrealistic goal. You will never kill 100% of an insect unless you're going with the good old scorched earth policy, which is just silly. The only time is really going to tell how quickly this spreads through the valley. You know, there's a lot of unknown factors. Like I mentioned, we don't quite have the same spread of ash as a lot of other communities that have already dealt with this. And frankly, it's going to be highly dependent on how quickly and the collective actions the community does to do our preventative actions. We do need to ensure that our most valuable trees get immediate care, and then we start working on picking off those medium to low value and making decisions about those. The aim is never to really remove all trees or to treat all trees. The aim is actually to manage your pace of removals. That's been the most effective management programs that we've seen in the past. We are not going to save every single ash tree in this valley. Trees will require indefinite treatment. There is a little bit of wavering to that. As pressure decreases, we can start to pull off those, but initially we need to treat it like every single ash tree will need to be treated or removed by the end of this. We need to identify our high and low value trees. We need to proactively remove trees that aren't worth saving. And then many ash trees, we need to realize may change in value over time. So one tree that may have been a high value at one point can decrease in value. A tree that was a low value tree suddenly flourished and is suddenly a high value tree. We need to be ready for those changes, because what you don't want to be stuck with is doing nothing. If you're on your HOA and you said, no, we're not going to worry about that till it's here. And suddenly you're looking down the barrel of removing dozens, if not hundreds of trees at the same time. That's a massive financial expense. We're going to have to make some hard decisions about the long-term viability of ash trees. Like I said, every tree is going to need to be treated for the remainder of its life or removed. And we need to decide as a community how we balance that cost between treatment and removal and eventual replacement, right? It's not like we're removing these trees and nothing will ever grow there again, right? We have the opportunity to change what's growing there. Not every ash should or will be eligible for saving. We need to focus on managing these removals over time. We need to initially treat a lot of these ash trees to reduce the spread and slowly wean that number off and bring us down to, like I said, the Noah's Ark, so to speak, of ash trees we're willing to treat indefinitely. It's important, especially to effectively communicate these expectations to residents, both from municipalities, HOAs, country clubs. Homeowners are going to be confused when you're going in there and you're proactively removing a tree that doesn't look like it has a problem. So you need to be able to explain that this is happening, why we're removing these trees proactively. We also need to be willing to be flexible because, like I said, values of trees change over time as they grow, as they respond to other factors, things like that. And we should be flexible enough to be able to review our plans annually because all of these factors are changing around us. So I'm going to run through a couple of identification pitfalls because I've already gotten at least a half dozen calls on these trees, which I love, by the way. Please keep calling me if you have suspicious trees. But we do have some common lookalike insects as far as their symptoms. Most commonly, lilac borer. It is literally everywhere in this valley. I have it on almost every ash tree in Basalt. Ash bark beetles, very common in drought-stricken areas. And then poor cultural care is the one that people tend to forget about, but can cause almost the same symptoms of dieback. Canopy dieback is usually what I get calls about, right? It's the thing everybody notices. If I didn't have those labels on there, I frankly could not tell you what was causing that problem on each of those trees. So this is not really a reliable symptom. Great alarm raiser though, right? But when you see something like dieback, that's your alarm. You need to call somebody that has the expertise to fully identify what's going on, or you need to look closer for other symptoms. Exit holes by far are the best singular diagnosis symptom, short of finding the actual insect. But if you come and look at the samples, those little buggers are small. I've actually only ever seen about a half dozen of them in my entire career, and they're all in files. You don't really see them flying around unless you're standing in a completely heavily invested ash tree. Emerald ash borer has that really unique and distinct D-shaped hole that's owning to the flat head. If you were to look at the insect head face on with those cool pictures Carl was showing us, that's the shape of the head as it's coming out of the tree, boring out of the tree. Lilac borer tends to be a little bit more regular shaped. You will find D-shaped exit holes with lilac borer. It's very common, but you will not find consistently D-shaped exit holes. You'll find a lot of irregular shapes, a lot of circles, a lot of kind of things that have filled in over time. Emerald ash borer will only produce D-shaped holes, and they tend to start in the upper canopy and move their way down through the tree as they further infest the tree. Ash bark beetle, I don't think is particularly, I think it's got its kind of own obvious site, but it's worth showing. It's a lot of little shot holes, almost pin size. That penny there has almost a dozen holes that fit on the size of that, the diameter of it. And then the galleries, again, this is probably something more for the local arborist listening in, but the feeding galleries do have differences. Ash bark beetle lays lines of eggs where they then all radiate outward as they feed. Emerald ash borer lays eggs singly, and they create that lovely little S shape as they kind of bounce back and forth between the response growth of the tree trying to choke off that insect feeding on the cambium. As Melissa's slides show, if you get a heavy infestation, a lot of that starts to overlap and becomes a little murkier. So again, you never really want to rely on one symptom alone to identify this. And then lilac borer has similar feeding galleries, but they tend to go deeper into the heartwood. It actually causes trees to snap in half because they lose their structural strength. So moral of the story, individual symptoms are not enough to provide a confident identification of any individual pest, but especially EAB. The D-shaped hole tends to be the most important singular symptom, but you really are looking for that whole list there. And really, I would not hesitate if you are suspicious at all. Please reach out to your local private tree care arborist. They know to call us if they're even more suspicious. Feel free to call any one of us. I think I speak for Carl and all the other arborists in town that, you know, we'd rather know about it and know where it's moving. I always tell homeowners a really great way to keep track of your tree health. Go in your yard, take a picture of your healthy ash tree and save that. And next year at the same time, stand in the same spot, take the same picture. And then you have a baseline of what you can compare it to. Because a lot of times our minds kind of look at trees and like, was that branch dead last year? Or did that happen last month? I don't really know. But then you'll have a picture to be able to compare that to. So you have a baseline of knowing if something is going awry. Quickly, we're going to go over the treatment options. There's three main options: trunk injection, soil drench, and trunk spray. They all have their own uses out in the field. Too long didn't read. Trunk injection tends to be the highly preferred method. And we're going to run through kind of the ups and downs of each of them. Trunk injection, like I said, it's probably the best option. It's nearly 100% effective at preventing EAB. It also lasts for several years. At least 2, and new studies are starting to say upwards of 3 if the disease or the insect pressure is low enough. It is the most expensive treatment, but when you cut that treatment into that 2-year interval, instead of having to do a treatment every year, it actually becomes very comparable. I've already gotten prices from the local tree care companies. And when you look at it, paying the big number once every 2 years versus a smaller number every year, they actually come out to about the same. The only downside to trunk injection is the tree does need to be of minimum size, generally about 6 inches DBH. I wouldn't have recommended anybody under like 8 inches, maybe even 10 inches, depending on the exact health and condition of the tree. If you were going to do trunk injection, and it must be applied by a trained technician. You can so easily damage the tree. In fact, you are purposefully damaging the tree when you do this injection because you're drilling holes into the trunk, you set plugs, and then you pressurize inject concentrated insecticide right into the tree. If they don't set those plugs right, if the hole's not deep enough, you can get what's called bark blast. And it literally creates a bubble of that insecticide that blows off the bark and that inner growth layer that we're trying to protect. And you can create more damage than you're actually helping in the long run. So again, bet your tree care company. Soil drench, mixed results on effectiveness. It's generally pretty effective as long as your tree is already healthy going into it. We talked a lot about how it needs water to take up this product, so you don't want to apply it during drought conditions. But otherwise, it can generally be applied anytime during the season because it does give you one full year, one full calendar year of effective protection. It's cheaper per application, but again, must be reapplied annually, and has the potential to move off target because we are essentially probing this product into the soil in a liquid form. And if you have either a tree near waterways, a body of water, I would not recommend that because again, there's that potential for leaching into the water. Or if you have a heavily planted flower bed within that same root zone area around the flare, you have the potential for all those flowers to take up this product. And this product is actually imidacloprid is the most common, which is kind of the big name bee colony collapse insecticide that they talk about. So we do need to be really careful about exactly how we apply that product. And then the third one, bark banding. You know, I generally don't recommend this except in very specific situations. Again, because I've started to shy away from anything that requires like an actual spray product because there's a lot of a chance for that to move off target. It has its uses. In fact, it's really useful when you can't use those soil drenches or the trunk injections, specifically in places where you're worried about leaching and or the tree is not big enough to be able to take up that trunk injection. But it does need to be applied annually and in a specific time window because you only get a couple months of protection from this treatment. And then it's also worth noting that you do have to add what's called a bark penetrant to get that product to be taken up through the bark, which means that if it goes off target onto your perennials, it'll actually burn those plants because it's literally lysing the cells to be able to move that product in. Last one, biocontrols. With Melissa, there's not a ton of information on this. It's actually an active area of study with the USDA. It does have some early promising results from where they've done releases, anywhere from 20 to 80% knockback of EAB. But it's still to be seen exactly how effective it'll be in larger regions and across the country. It's not really an option for homeowners. I would never recommend a homeowner releasing exotic insects in their backyard. That's a really great way to get EAB 2.0. So we just should leave these to the institutions, government agencies. There is the potential for us to reach out to the USDA, to APHIS, to see if we would be an eligible location for releases, but that's, again, all part of this evolving conversation. And then last slide, the long-term expectations. We really are going to be dictated by this insect for the next 5 to 10 years as far as our tree management is concerned. It's never going to go away. We're going to have to learn to live with it. We're going to have an initial spike outbreak, and then after that, I would suspect that we're going to have a little bit of quieting down in one town, and it'll pop up over here in the next town, and they'll get it under control, and then it'll pop up over down valley, and then they'll get it under control. And we're going to just have to work on these proactive measures to really try to reduce that spread. We should expect, as the average resident, to see new policies arising from this tree management dealing with this insect, because it is so invasive that it really necessitates a community effort. Things like requiring new diversity of trees when we get plantings in. So not just planting another freaking autumn blaze maple, no more. Invasive pest policy and enforcement. So requiring homeowners to remove infested trees. Seeing how communities can potentially manage and support private residences. I've already gotten calls about whether the town of Basalt is offering vouchers, things like that. I'm not signing any town up for that, because frankly, we all have to chart our own path with this one. And that is going to be very dependent on what kind of resources every town is going to be dealing with. But I do want to point out that because we have really jumped on the ball with this, I think we will have a lot of commonalities throughout the valley. And I think we will be working pretty well together as a community. And I just want to end it with a little bit of a bright note, because I feel like it's always doom and gloom with emerald ash borer. We can see this as an opportunity. We can use this to improve our urban tree canopy. We can get that diversity in there that we didn't used to have when we used to plant stuff by the hundreds in the 80s and 90s. This will make our urban tree canopy more resilient, and we'll be able to fight off the next round of EAB as it shows up. We're also, frankly, having to deal with replacements as it is with climate change happening. I mean, for crying out loud, it was like 100 degrees this past month. I've never felt such a hot July in Colorado. And this will really allow us to experiment with more drought tolerant species. And the last line being native species. OMG, we should be planting more native species. When you have an opportunity, when you have a space that allows it, favor the native option, because those trees tend to be able to handle what's thrown at them in their particular space a lot better than the introduced species we bring in. I understand that there's a lot of give and take with that. There's some ups and downs too, because we don't really have a ton of great native tree species, but there are options out there, and there's always new cultivars of these species coming out. So planting native, or what I call native-like species, is always a great option. All right.
Thank you.
We'll move into the question. Just
We'll start our questions in just a few moments here. We do have, let's see, we want to go into questions and answers from us first as a tree board. We have two other boards here tonight. So questions and answers for the tree board.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm been active with the tree board since 1995. We have worked very hard to have a diversity of species planted in Carbondale. Our goal was to have not more than 10% of any one species anywhere. And we've done pretty well with that. As Carl mentioned earlier, we have about 10% ash trees overall in town. River Valley Ranch may have a little more concentration, but overall in town, it's a little different situation with River Valley Ranch. So we've worked hard with that. The other thing is Joanne makes about 2000 or maybe a little bit before, we took the ash tree off our recommended street tree list when emerald ash borer showed up. So and it's a recommended list. The other thing that the town has in our ordinance our Director of Public Works does have the ability to declare a tree, a hazard tree on private property and require that homeowner to remove that tree. We can't require that they treat the tree, but we can require that they do that. So I have some questions though about relationships with HOAs, because there's indication that one of the HOAs in our area, it already started spraying trees as a result of our discovery. How do we handle that? That's, you know, Chris or Carl, or Melissa, how do we handle that?
Yeah, okay. I deal with very similar problems in Basalt. We have a lot of HOAs that either do their own thing or don't do their own thing and don't purposefully do nothing. And a lot of it comes down to just engaging with them. And like I said, trying to reach out to them and saying, hey, this is what the town's saying is best management practices. This is what, you know, the experts are saying are the best options. And frankly, just asking, hey, why did you choose to do spray treatments? I mean, when you say spray treatments, are they doing like the bark banding spray treatment, or are they doing like a big foliar spray?
I think they did a foliage spray.
Yeah. And frankly, I would not recommend foliar treatments for this insect, but for a variety of reasons, mostly environmental, because I tend to shy away from those if at all possible. But I think it comes down to just engaging with those HOAs. Sometimes I've run into where they're just very bullheaded, frankly, and they want to do their own thing. And at the end of the day, that's, unless you create a policy that says no foliar sprays in town, there's no real, you know, legal way to stop them from doing what they like. And I understand that frustration, because I do have to deal with it a lot.
Thanks for coming. I have a few questions because I've been reading extensively on the last, it's an adult now, 21 years of ash borer. A comment on native species. We need to look at that on an altitudinal gradient, because a lot of spruce trees are native, but they don't belong in the town. And when I was cruising around here looking at it, I think that might be our next issue when we start looking at budworm, other different kinds of infestations. So I think looking at some adapted things may be to our advantage as well. And to that point, what about the next species that we have an issue with of tree? And then when we are looking to see where these insects are on a height of the tree, we don't find them on the main stem. They start up in where most of the leaf canopy is, where the nice juicy stuff is, and then they'll work their way down. Okay. Are we looking at any kind of pheromone trapping? Have you looked into that? There's been quite a bit of research done on that. It's interesting.
I haven't particularly looked at that. I know that trapping for this insect is really challenging in low density populations. I mean,
Okay.
in terms of just the approach to using Lindgren funnel traps that would use a pheromone to attract a beetle of this type. It's not going to be like a Japanese beetle trap that we're battling down in Grand Junction, where they're highly attractive to it, regardless of really the abundance of the population. It's really going to be linked to how much EAB is here. If a trap is going to catch an EAB, it's because there's lots of EAB in the environment. And Chris may have comments on that too.
Yeah, I would generally agree with that. Pheromone traps they're kind of a mixed bag, because in one respect, you're almost attracting that insect, right, to that space. So if I'm using it in basalt, for instance, to see if it's in the area, I'm almost a little worried that am I encouraging it to move, you know, an insect to move to wherever I'm putting that. I've kind of taken the opinion that I treat it like it's in the valley now, and knowing where it is and is not is going to be more up to where those infested trees are more than anything. I did want to speak though to your comment about the native trees. 100%, I agree that, and that's why I said native trees where it makes sense and native trees where the native tree belongs. Because I agree that with this whole elevation gradient that we live on, trees that, you know, when you look at the big regional map, say they're native here, but they're actually native, you know, way up at the top of Cyprus or something. And I love seeing new adapted species come in to try out new species all the time. As basalt's an accredited arboretum, so I have to introduce new species to keep that status going. And we've identified a couple of fun new trees in the last few years that have good potential for the future of our valley.
Is that over by past the circle? Is that where that arboretum is in that food forest? Is that where you're?
So actually, technically, the entire town is considered the
Oh,
arboretum.
really? Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It's and we use a tree mapping software, and I have intention to get the digital map going on our website so you can look at every tree that grows in basalt, every tree we're trialing, and be able to go out in the field and look at it and say, oh, that thing's not surviving very well, or, you know, because I do have a lot of trees that I put in the field knowing full well they probably won't make it. But, you know, if you hit that one tree that does really well here that we didn't know about, that's just another species you can add to that diversification.
You doing any of that Liberty elm in there?
The what?
The Liberty elm?
I've got at least 20 different cultivars of hybrid elms going in
Oh,
town.
really?
Yeah. Choice City is probably my favorite one right now.
Okay.
But we've got, I mean, I try to actually source through the local nursery, like all sorts of whatever I can find for new releases.
Thank you.
Actually, Kentucky coffee tree is a really common one in other parts of the country that I'm surprised I don't see more when I moved here. And I've been planting that like crazy to see if it's an elevation reason or if it just does well. And we haven't tried
We've
it.
had pretty good success. We have about 4 or 5.
Yeah. And
They're slow growing, and that's what the problem
Right.
is. It sits as a stick for like 5 or
I know.
6 years.
trying to yell it to my guys, don't remove that. It's not dead.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, no, actually sweet gum is another one that we just tried that seems to be doing really well, surprisingly, which despite it's kind of on the fringe of our hardiness zone. In fact, I couldn't grow it in Chicago, which is the same hardiness zone as here, but I have one in our park that's done fabulously the last couple of years.
Thank you.
Marty.
First off, thank you all for coming, sharing your knowledge with us, which was on a different subject, but it is what it is. I have a question. Pitkin, Eagle, Garfield, unincorporated counties. We can be come up with the best practices, excuse me, for Carbondale. You go 2 miles outside of Carbondale in one direction, it's unincorporated Garfield. You go 4 miles in the other direction, it's unincorporated Eagle County. How are they in terms of having the resources? And are they being brought to the table as well?
Well, I have a hard time answering that because I don't know what their resources are. Probably not great, if I'm being honest. That's part of it's gonna be an effort on all of our towns' parts to at minimum help them with PSAs and knowing having the information so they can make a decision for themselves. We do get that little bit of an advantage where this ash tree not being native, there's probably a low chance that the average unincorporated rural home has a boatload of ash trees around it. They may have one off, and frankly, a lot of those get missed. That's the one time I saw resistance, so to speak, in Chicago is somebody in a neighborhood that full of oak trees that they were the one guy that planted a white ash, 40 years ago, never treated it, looked beautiful, and and it does just fine. But I think at the end of the day, it really will just be about us trying to push that communication bandwidth out as far as we can and encourage people at things like community events, like the First Fridays, like this Basalt concert series that we have now, like the farmers markets that every town puts on, having that information there when people come into town and they can see that. And at minimum, then they're aware of what's going on. And that's about as good as you can do. We can't force anyone to do anything.
And at least for us, I see 2 next steps. I see our Parks and Rec Department is here. I see Parks and Rec Commission is here. And the Environmental Board is here. So getting them to coordinate with the tree board and with the trustees and call, of course, to come up with a coordinated plan of how to, attack this. And thank you. I mean, this is education. I've never seen a tree board with so many people in the audience.
Plus, we need 2 more members, so if anybody.
Yeah, if you're interested,
Yeah, we are
please.
recruiting. Tree board members, are there any other questions? We'll go to the next board.
I just had one question. Considering the long-term treatment that you guys described, is there any concern or reports of development of resistance in the pesticides that you guys listed?
To my knowledge, at least the trunk injected products, they're not seeing any resistance develop. It's a mode of action that is fairly sound, but some of these broad spectrum sprays, of course, these
Yeah.
foliar sprays, absolutely, 100%.
Any other questions? Go ahead, John.
If we're going to do an information campaign, is there a way to create a calendar of what to look for? And this year would have been an anomaly because the season was so late. So when you have your Audubon Christmas count, can you tell me where you're finding all of your woodpeckers and your nuthatches, which are winter residents? When it starts to get nice out, and you look at the way the leaves are getting chewed up, you look at ash sawfly, that comes on later, and that's chewed up leaves are looking different than what this emerald ash borer is. And you got a good ID time, because the way I'm reading it is they've got to eat before they can mate. And so is there a time to start IDing for the next round of treatment? We'll go get our first set of trees, since it's an ongoing thing. Decide what's worth it, what's not.
Yeah, most of them I have like an actual, rough annual month to month when things are flying versus mating versus larvae are feeding versus pupating.
It's going to be different because it's new here.
Right.
We don't exactly know.
Right.
Right. It's,
And frankly, it may be different in Glenwood versus Aspen versus Basalt, just because we have that range there that, I mean, even the seasons are a month and a half difference between the one end of the valley to the other. But I 100% think the more information we can get out to the better. I think that'll probably be a topic of the next EAB group meeting we have, is what's the next informational piece we get out. These flyers we made, they were pretty, like, we want to get something out there quick, very simple for anyone to pick up. It's actually got the QR code on front and back that takes you to the Colorado State Forestry website that Melissa was showing at the end of her slides. But I think there's there'd be some worth some making a more full informational packet for those that would be interested in that. And I always encourage people, like the photo taking every year. It is nice to, once you see leaves coming out, just do a rough evaluation of your whole yard, not just your ash tree, but be aware of what's going in your yard. You could have problems that are happening in May that you just don't realize until August, when everything is falling off of it, So I guess to answer that question, it's worth just having everybody put it in their calendar when they do their spring landscape cleanup, when leaves are coming out. That's a great time to check. How's my ash tree doing? Is it leafing out later than I think? Is it not leafing out at all? Am I noticing some weird symptoms that I've been told to look out for? But all season, I think you can really get new symptoms showing up on ash tree, all growing season at least.
All right, thank you. I would like to invite the Parks and Rec Commission. Any representatives from that group that would like to
Alice?
ask questions?
Very briefly, I just want to acknowledge Chris Hassig, one of our other trustees, is here tonight. Thank you for showing up, Chris.
Oh, you can sit at that.
Sit at this desk.
There's a mic up here.
Alice, yeah, there you go. Thank you. Hi, Eric.
Thank you.
For those of people who don't know you, please identify yourself.
My name's Hollis Sutherland, and I am the chair of the Parks and Rec Commission. And I'm very grateful that you invited us here for this and for the informative presentation. Thank you. My questions are kind of basic and they may expand outside of just parks, trying to understand how we might want to approach this, as a town. Carl, what are you doing with the wood chips when do you burn them after you chip it, or how are they handled? Because we can't use them like down in the nature park to walk on the trails and.
Right, yeah, so there's some good data out there that says if you chip the material to an inch and smaller, then it's okay to transport to another designated area. But I don't think any of us would recommend reusing it, at any point. So that's a big part of our educational strategy here in town and in the valley. It's just making sure people aren't moving it around during certain times and taking it to the correct place.
Okay. Is this part of the plan that we're coming up with as a town will be how we're going to work with private citizens and the HOA people? I mean, that's kind of like okay. YTD. Is there I feel like I should know this, but we don't usually use this at the parks meetings, is an inventory of the trees that are in all of our parks.
Yep, no, we have an inventory. And the last one was done or updated in 2010. So a lot of what I'm doing right now is just updating that specifically the ash trees. Because in calculating costs, you need to know the diameter of the tree because that's linked to the cost amount for the treatments. And also the condition, is it treatable? Do I think it's a high value tree? So my goal is to have that updated in a few weeks. And then I can make a list of saying, okay, this is what I think is high value or not. And then we can look at that together too, as a community. And then really identify that list. And like Chris was saying, we need to look towards what trees do we want to be able to still be around 10 or 15 years later, because certain ones we select, we're going to have to treat for many years. And that's a budgetary thing to consider. And also, like Chris said, we may have to treat a certain percentage just in the beginning, but then phase some out, but just to kind of slow the spread. Yeah.
And so do you see the parks, the Park and Rec Commission being involved in that once you have that information then and a discussion around that?
Yep, of course. Yep.
And all that.
I want to make that, what I think is a high value tree. I want to make that available so that everyone in the community can review those trees.
And then, as long as you were talking about that, when we decide which ones we want to, are high value trees that we want to protect, will that be something that would be under the Parks and Rec budget then for that? Or is that is that like, where is the?
Right.
Or is that town?
Alice, I think you're getting ahead of yourself here.
Okay, well, I'm
There's-
just asking. We are going into budget season now,
If there's one
Marty.
good thing about this, the timing is good. Because as we get a plan together, what's it gonna cost?
Uh-huh.
How are we gonna pay for it?
Okay,
Is it Parks and Rec? Is it from general funds? Is it from Public Works? I don't have those. No one has those answers yet. Okay, but
but
I
thank,
can promise you this. You will have a say in the process.
yeah, no problem. I just trying to understand the overall.
Yeah, no, I know.
the
We just
overall
don't know
thing.
yet.
Okay.
Sure.
The comment I have is there's cost share programs to investigate. So the cost is not so tremendous. And I think that there's so many unique approaches here. So just consider out of the Grand Valley, we have an ash cost share program for ash bark beetle and lilac ash borer, where the city of Grand Junction and private citizens couple together and cost share treatment. So there's lots of approaches here. And yes, I'm sure right now we're in the phase where the dust is settling. So not to interject, but there's
No,
lots,
that's
there's
fine.
lots
Thank you.
lots of ideas to come.
And I'd
Hopefully.
like to say, we hope to have our preliminary recommendations to the Board of Trustees at one of their September meetings, which is pretty amazing when you consider that June was when we discovered, and we've made give a presentation to the Board of Trustees in September. And they'll make some decisions on how we move forward.
And we're still in budget process at that time.
So that's, we're trying to move quickly with getting, that's why we invited these people here for this meeting. too.
Yeah, and that's great. And I appreciate that. Just trying to get ahead of what I
And
might be
have
responsible
your
for.
comments too.
So then once you look, Carl, once we have this inventory going then with the trees and we kind of decide like some that might need to get removed or whatnot. How do we decide what gets replanted and that whole phase? I mean, is that part of this plan too, where we'll have a reforestation thing or replacement
Yeah, so
thing?
just to say broadly, we already have a recommended streets tree list that, the tree board has put together years ago and, so we can draw from that. But realistically, it comes down to where was the tree removed and what is that site like? Because not every site is going to be good for having a tree again
Mhm.
for a lot of different reasons. In general, if I remove a tree, say in the right of way or anywhere, I try to replant it if I can, if it makes sense. Sometimes it just doesn't. And it'll be the similar thing for this. But, as we're working through the plan, that can also be identified saying, okay, this will be removed, but it doesn't make sense to put a tree here. So we won't put another one back here,
Okay, okay, great. And I guess my last one is just, what would you like to see from the Parks and Rec Commission? That you might want us to take at our next.
What-
Yeah,
What we're most
Okay.
concerned about is the treatment part of it. Because, sprays obviously aren't gonna work well in parks.
Mhm.
People use them.
Yeah.
Dogs use them. I mean, and pollinators,
Right.
the overall health of our parks. So, that's one of the things that we're really concerned about is are the treatment methods really gonna work well in those different environments? I mean, if we're along Cypress Park, along the ditch, where we planted a number of ash trees and hoping that we could eliminate the Siberian elms and the ashes would take over,
Mhm.
we're not gonna do a soil drench.
Right,
So it's, that creates, so is it the right tree in the right place? And that's like when we go to replacement tree, like Carl was alluding to, are we gonna have the right tree in the right place? And that's a crystal ball, believe me. It's,
Mhm.
I like to say the trees that I planted in that I helped in Arbor Days in 1996, 98. I'll never live to see that tree be at its full glory,
Mhm.
but somebody else will.
Right, absolutely. Yep, and we do have a integrated weed management plan.
Yes, which is great.
Which is fairly, I think it's pretty comprehensive, but anyway, I think I'm done with my questions. So Eric.
My name is Eric Brenner. I'm the Parks and Rec Director for the town of Carbondale. My question is kind of on a public safety side, and it really looks like these trees, once infected, do die fairly rapidly. And so if you have a 30% die out of the canopy, I mean, should we be worried if that's in a public open space in a public park about public safety hanging out around that tree and our wind storms and how, how quickly will that tree get brittle and does it get brittle from the top down? It looked that way on some of the photos. And is it treatable, at that 20-30% and still being would it still be a safe tree?
Right. I think Chris made some good points, like, some trees might be treatable, but we may not like how it looks afterward. And this is part of why if you look at other towns' plans, they'll say, okay, we're going to treat a certain percentage and we're just going to start removing other ones that are in categories that we're not declaring as high value because of the risk factor. If it takes 2 to 4 years, for the tree to die, but then all of a sudden you may have this massive wave at that 2 years in or something. So I think we can preemptively do some removals in our plan and reduce risk. And that seems to be a common practice. Chris, or I don't know if you guys have any other.
Yeah, proactive removals on our low quality ash, like that one you showed, that frankly probably shouldn't even be there because it's totally crowded out by everything else around it. Those are like easy, low hanging fruit, so to speak. The bigger, harder decisions are, okay, once we've gotten through those easy ones that no one's going to miss, or that we're actually improving the space around them because now you're giving more space for the other trees to grow. The harder decisions is, all right, what is the final end all list that we're willing to treat indefinitely? And how are we going to convey that to the public that these ones didn't make the cut, even though it may be your favorite tree that you planted as a child? You know, that's where it gets really murky. And frankly, you guys as a tree board have a leg up on that, because you can say, you know, we came together as a town and decided this. I kind of struggle with that a little more because it's just me having to make those decisions for basalt, and a lot of basalt, you know, it's younger. It's got a lot. Most of my ash trees are actually very small compared to what you guys probably deal with on an average ash tree. So I have a little bit of advantage there, but I'm looking at, I have a neighborhood in Southside that's probably half ash trees. Willits, at least 2 of the blocks, the entire block of street trees is ash tree. And it's going to end up being I probably will proactively remove like a third, every third one, replace it with a different species, so that when eventually, you know, we're not losing that whole canopy at once. And speaking to that, you know, as you get infested trees that you then decide, no, we need to treat that, we want to say that certainly you can treat an infested tree, and there's a decent chance it'll survive. But it will come down to, you know, Carl being a certified arborist, looking at it and saying, you know, even if it survived and it saved every limb that's still on there that's alive, we're losing this half of the canopy. It's going to be totally weight loaded on one side, and we're just going to be creating more hazard than if we just call it quits on this particular tree. And those are, frankly, they're just all hard decisions that we're just going to have to deal with.
Okay, so you have a tree that is infested, but not heavily infested, but you know it's infested and you can treat it at that time. Can you take out the infested parts of the upper canopy of the tree and still save that tree? Okay.
I'd actually recommend that if you had an infested tree, remove the dead. The dead's not doing anything for that tree. And in fact, you'll create space for then the tree to recuperate and kind of fill that spot back out over time.
Okay, great. That was my main question, just because that gives us some options then, you know, not just taking out 10% of our trees in town overnight. So
yeah, I would not recommend doing that.
Thank you. Any other questions from Parks and Rec?
You know, in our integrated weed management plan, we do have a kind of notification of herbicide use process there. And so, and that's really reading through the plan been for airborne herbicides though. So there's no real detail in there for an injectable, you know, herbicide into a tree. So maybe we just need to look at that and some of the potential effects to the public of that process too. So just wanted to make sure we know that should be on our discussion board for sure.
Yeah, actually, to that point, a very common practice in all the cities that have dealt with this, and granted, they've been dealing with it before the advent of the easily accessible online tree inventory software we have now. You can buy, you buy little tags that if you're treating your ash tree, you put it on there, and then everybody knows it's treated, and they don't need to call the town being like, oh my gosh, my neighbor's got an untreated tree, because it's got your, you know, that's something I'm considering for private residents, is purchasing an order of essentially their little silver tags for trees. And if somebody says they're going to treat their tree, going and giving them this tag, and it has a year on it of when it was treated. And that's also a little public informational thing. You know, you can throw QR codes on those tags now that'll send you to, you know, a tree inventory. They've become a little less popular, I think, with the advent of online digital maps, because they used to be actually the inventory, right? They had a number on it, but they still have their value in that they can relay that information to the public when they're standing there.
Yeah, I like that. I think for our community would appreciate notification like that for treated trees.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to invite the members of the environmental board up for questions.
Hi there. I'm Hannah Hunt Moeller, the chair of the environmental board. Thank you all so much for the presentation and information. Super helpful. I'd like to ask some specific questions about the treatment. and environmental impact of the treatment, and then also some clarifying questions between treatment strategies versus prevention strategies. So kind of from the environmental board standpoint, a lot of our discussions of a board have been about what's the larger environmental impact of some of these treatments, which you all, spoke about. And so one kind of question around that I have would be, if a tree is a low value tree, is there a recommendation to not try to use some sort of chemical treatment or chemical prevention and remove it, as opposed to trying to use chemicals from a kind of environmental standpoint? Or is there some benefit toward doing some kind of treatment to stop the spread, which then has, also environmental impact? So just trying to kind of understand that a little bit more clearly.
I'll speak just a little bit. I think some of it depends on the size of the tree, where it's located, and how easily it could just be like removed.
Right.
Like just technically, because a certain number of trees, I'll be able to just do myself once we make declarations and having a chipper, and I'll be able to just get them out, they're removed and gone. Now they're, like Chris is saying, there may be other ones are a little bit harder decisions that maybe we don't, I don't want to get rid of all of those quite yet, but we want to keep these, and that's where there could be some gray area. And also depending on budgets, we may not be able to treat everything at once. So we may have to phase out over a year or two or something. So, it can be complicated, but.
The trunk injections are not, in my mind, a big environmental hazard. I mean, some of these, people that take the approach of doing broad spectrum sprays, that's a different story. But I think it does seem like that's the way things would lean, would be, in my mind. I'd recommend trunk injection. Not only do you have multi-year treatment, you don't have that environmental hazard, and the chemical amamectin benzoate is not harming honeybees. There's data to support that.
And following up on that, that's part of what I'll end up having to do is we'll have our ash tree collection. You choose the ones you're not going to treat initially and put those on the removal list either immediately or down the road. And then you have your treatment list, and then deciding what treatment is used on every tree. And I think in my mind, I agree. I heavily favor the trunk injection. One, because it's an every other year application, which gives you the opportunity actually to treat half your trees one year, half your trees the next year, and keep alternating. So you spread the cost out a little bit more. But you also then you're putting that product directly into that tree. There's no chance for it to move off target, so to speak. It's why I actually don't recommend that bark banding spray in almost any situation. There are very few situations I'd say, yeah, that's the only one that makes sense. The imidacloprid or the probing soil drench injections, I will probably only consider those for like tree wells in our urban spaces where there's a guarantee there. It's the only thing inhabiting that soil space, and it's all a manufactured soil space at that. I probably would not recommend using those in any park setting or anywhere that there's other potential for that product to leach anywhere into a different body that you don't want it to be in.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. In terms of the injection, the trunk injection, have you all seen, well, I guess one clarifying question, is that a treatment and prevention, or is that really just if it's infected, then you could use that, or?
It's
one or the other?
primarily a preventative
More
tactic.
prevention. Yeah.
It certainly can be used as a curative, so to speak, but most people employ it as a preventative tactic.
And is there a benefit toward making specific recommendations to guide toward the trunk injection? And have you seen that, Chris, like in some of the other communities? Is it helpful to have like the arsenal of options so that people can, it's better to treat it one way or another, or
It's a
benefit to kind of direct
Yeah.
policy towards saying that we think this is the best, economically, environmentally,
that's
effective wise?
That's a tricky question, only because part of the reason I actually moved to Colorado is because the state of Illinois and Chicago are so relaxed on pesticide application that there was a lot of sketchy things happening, so to speak, and that I didn't approve of, and frankly, just didn't want to be a part of. But I certainly think that like I outlined in my slides, there are very specific cases where you can't use trunk injection, but it would be like the recommended option in any case where you could use it. So you could certainly come up with that list. And I think that's something that's worth talking about at our EAB group for providing another type of flyer for, here are your treatment options. This is what you should use. You know, all the towns and cities in the valley are recommending this because it's supported by data that it's lowest environmental impact, et cetera, et cetera. Here are your other options that, while you can do them, are not recommended. And frankly, you can use it's not as an effective of an option as a really good selling point to not do them because they're not as effective. They can be, not to say they aren't effective, but the best surefire treatment is the trunk injection. And I think there's a lot of selling points that make it a pretty easy decision for most homeowners to do. The cost is usually the biggest issue with the trunk injection. So just trying to.
What is the cost?
I've had costs anywhere from like $15 to $22 an inch, depending on what company and part of the country you talk to. DBH. Yes, sorry. Inch DBH. Yes. And that's another thing to consider. And I'll be talking to some of the tree care companies. Very common practice in Chicago is an HOA doesn't want to pay for the privately owned trees, but they can get a deal with like calling a tree care company and saying, hey, if we can get 25 of our homeowners to sign up to Tree to Tree, we can reduce that price by 10% or something like that. And that helps, again, another cost sharing sort of a method to because frankly, I always want to encourage the trunk injection unless it's not an option.
Just to add quickly to that, there's lots of Colorado State Forest Service resources, and there's a specific CSU extension fact sheet that talks about insecticide use in ash. And I would be using those resources so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I mean, there's lots of even statewide resources you could pull from to make your own or just use those.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. I know people would be quite interested in having that be a public resource, whether pulling from CSU extension or, making that available.
Thank you. Any more questions?
No.
Thanks.
Okay, I'd like to
Thanks,
invite,
Hannah.
yeah, thank you much. I'd like to invite the public up.
I have one question about minimum diameter for injection. Is there one?
There is, it's 6 inches. In practice, I tend to recommend more like 8 to 10. Just because, again, you're creating wounds every time you're doing that. And so you need the actual surface area to do enough drill in so that you're not girdling the tree just by drilling all those holes.
Follow up on that. When you put this in, is it like a stent if you're or a port? Chemotherapy?
It's a plastic plug that you hammer into the tree. And if you set it right, the tree will physically grow over it and it just envelops the plug and it stays in the tree forever.
Okay, you wouldn't use it the second time?
No, you never reuse plugs. Yep. And in fact, that's an ongoing area of research is what happens after 20 plus years of these injections every other year, because you do have to move sites, you move up and down the trunk after years and years. And I've seen trees that I've been to that are on their 5th, 6th round of injections. Some of them respond super well to it. And frankly, you can't even find the old injection sites. Some of them that were older, were already stressed. They don't respond to wounding as well. Maybe they were already infested somewhat. Those are the ones that you start to see the negative effects build up over time of those injections. And that's where you start to talk about changing values. And is this tree truly worth saving, or is it possible to save it anymore? Because it just can't handle the treatments anymore. And that certainly happens. And frankly, I think we'll find that that's an ongoing thing, because we're really only so far into this insect in the country.
I'd like to add, Carl is doing an alley or doing inventory of trees in the parks. And I helped do an inventory on street trees. We're pretty fortunate. We planted our ash trees kind of a long time ago. Most of our trees are over 9 inches. So the trees that we're looking at trying to treat, or do basal pruning on.
The final pruning cut, yes.
We have, it kind of makes it a little bit easier for us. We're not looking at, a tree that looks vigorous and is only 4 inches in diameter, and we're trying to
And I'm running into the exact opposite situation where most of our ash trees in basalt are under 10 inches DBH. And frankly, they're a mixed bag of quality because they're street trees, and it's kind of what happens to street trees is they either take or don't. And so I'm going to have to, there's going to be some conversations to be had long-term, again, trying to phase those sorts of trees out.
All right, great. Thank you for waiting, public. We have 10 minutes available for you. And if you, come on up. I see you can line up if you'd like, or take turns, however you'd like to do it. I was wondering for the
Lisa, could you please just come to the mic and just give us your name?
Okay.
And I know where you're from, but not
Okay.
everyone else does.
I am Lisa DiNardo. And Chris, I was wondering regarding customers that come into the nursery, vetting the contractors that are certified in the tree injection. I know you could work on a list. Is there anybody preliminary that recommendations?
Without that, starting that list and coming up with our qualifications, I really don't think I can say one way or the other. My recommendation to homeowners that need an answer now, it's looking for, the company should have ISA certified arborists on it. They should have their QS and their CPO pesticide spraying license. Those two things go a long way to say that the company cares enough to keep themselves knowledgeable on these things. Look for those industry certifications, and every company that has them will proudly show it on every truck and car that they have.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for a great presentation. I've known Lisa for 25 years. I was sure she's going to ask about the bees, but I want to ask about the birds. And I want to ask if the systemic trunk treatment is harmful to the beneficials like woodpeckers. Is there an analysis or risk assessment with the use of the insecticide? I know it's, the mode of operation is different, but is there a chance for secondary poisoning?
I mean, with a probed soil injection of imidacloprid, that's a broad spectrum chemical. So insects are going to be impacted broadly by that. I can't speak to birds. I'm not sure. I would think we could look at the EPA label to get that info. But yeah, if anyone else has comments, I'm actually unaware. If it impacts birds, I would think it's unlikely, but that'd be a complete guess. So I'm not sure.
Oh, sorry. My name is Daniel Ferguson. I'm chair of the environmental committee in the Rotary Club. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Public, please come on up. Next person.
Thank you for all of your time. My name is Sam Martinez. I'm a certified arborist. I'm a partner in Colorado Ash. I have 13 years of experience treating emerald ash borers, and we have currently 5,000 trees underneath our protection with a 97% success rate. I just had some questions about the strategies, and if anybody has brought forth to the board any of the data that the Purdue University and their extensions have been putting out. In the past 2 months, on May 9th, they released an article with an updated study with data behind it, showing how often to treat, how often to treat, the pros and cons of it. They also have in it a cost calculator that, again, depending on the price per inch, it is a way to calculate how long treating a tree will stay less than the cost of removing it, which includes, I feel I don't even need to go on to tell you what that includes, the stump grinding, the replanting, all of this, all of it. With with the proposal that we would like to offer, it stays under the amount of removal for 20 to 30 years. The amount in our proposal is 20%, about 20% of the number that you were saying earlier. So there's multiple strategies to combat the cost, to make it realistic, and if only to save a percentage or to complement the strategy that you're already putting into effect. But I think that it's important to know all of those details that is science-backed, which is what we do as arborists, is the highest standard of care for trees. And removal is a last option after all other options have been discussed and shown light upon. In that article, they show that if you are not in a hotspot, switching to a 3-year plan is perfectly acceptable, and it only shows dieback and damage after 4 years. There's been studies. So I think it is important to think about which trees are 30% or more and just not worth saving. Absolutely, that is definitely, but also how many we can, how realistic it is, and how we're sticking true to our arborist ethics code of that is a last resort that should be discussed, and all other resources should be discussed. So I know that cost can be scary, to be tied to something for years, every 2 years, with a high cost of, I mean, I can do the number. We don't need to go there, but what if we could take that number and cut it into a fourth? And after removing the trees that are not salvageable, deemed unsalvageable, and the other ones that haven't really had effect to them, as this study shows, we can switch to a 3-year plan. So there's the 3-year plan strategy that cuts costs about 60% is the math that I did on it. So you up the milliliter into it, but less frequently. So you're introducing less points of exposure, disease and pests to enter, less holes, less treatments, less visits, less, it's just better. And the studies have shown this. So that number that I'm saying that can be a fourth of, now let's cut that in half again, because let's cut that into thirds, because we're on a 3-year plan. So these are all strategies that have shown to help mitigate that scary cost number. And on top of that, there are other strategies as well that some people have introduced. So there is a G4 chemical that is unrestricted, but as long as you put in and you create the graphs and the sheets for an increased amount, the tree is still getting the same amount of the chemical, but it's just a little bit more watered down, which does 2 things. One advantage of that people have found is a quicker uptake. It's less resistance during uptake also leads to less blowouts, less damage in the tree, and as also a more cost-effective option as well. I think having all of these strategies in place can also help for mitigating this issue. Because like you said, there's no eradicating. That's why the different strategies are really important.
Yes, thank you. Are you complete?
I think that is all that I should be saying right now, and I should let other people speak, but that is all that I can say about the health of the trees. And that's all that that's all I'm here for.
Incredible insight, analysis. I hope, since you are a certified arborist, there is this group that's starting to form. So hopefully that's a place for you to fit in and present some more of this.
Thank you. I'd love to make a slideshow or anything that I can to help.
Sure.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank
Where are
you.
you based out of?
Between here and Indianapolis,
That's a wide range.
well, here in Carbondale and Indianapolis.
It's still a wide range.
You
The second
should-
produced, so I get the Indianapolis part.
Exactly. They've been on the ground floor since the beginning, and we've been working with scientists or with the Purdue Extension offices, with towns, and we have been giving accurate, effective treatments by working with them.
So I echo the suggestion. I think you should work with this board.
I would love to, if you're extending that invitation.
I'm sure if you're open to it.
I just like to help.
There's no lack of wanting knowledge, and cost-effective knowledge is always appreciated.
Thank you.
But we're not the ones who are gonna decide.
Absolutely. That's I just bring forth the information. This is what I tell homeowners is I just bring forth the information and they can make whatever decisions they want from there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Other members from the,
Where you go?
I have two questions for you. Since this is an emergent condition here in our town, when I was reading the literature, it often said that when it's starting up like this, it takes 2 years, and you said it too, it takes 2 years to get those larvae to pupate and get out of the tree.
So that can be a strategy as well, as beginning on a 2-year plan. And then what they say in the article is once it is stabilized, and if we're having a good proactive plan about this and taking out the ones that are just standing timber food, 30% dead or more,
Right?
that I think that it can be really effective.
And Purdue is the land grant college for the state of Indiana, correct?
And they have offices in Michigan and.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Okay.
and
They're like
offices through Illinois, Indiana.
Interpol.
Yes, they've been on the ground floor making studies, collecting data, which is what we follow as arborists, data.
Okay,
That's-
so when I was looking at the literature, I didn't see this one come up, so I should
This is a
just go to
study that just
Purdue.
came out in
So I
May
should-
9th.
And is it a technical paper? Or is it a service and action kind of bulletin? Is
This-
Where was it published?
On the website, and I can get the link before the end of
I would
this.
like that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Other members from our public tonight.
Hello. My name's Laura Criswell. I was born and raised here in the Valley and partnered up with my friend Sam. We traveled together in our youth and he brought this to me and we saw the westward movement coming, and so here we are. I was curious about timelines. I'm wondering if there's like a projected start date for starting treatment, if you guys know when the ash trees start to come out of dormancy here in the valley, or if it's still new observations.
I think it varies a little bit depending on the town, right?
Yeah, of course.
I actually can watch Glenwood and know what's going to happen in Basalt 2-3 weeks later.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm planning on implementing a Basalt plan within probably as soon as next spring for our highest value trees. But again, it's a moving target because to some extent, I'd like to observe how fast it starts moving through the valley, how quickly Carl starts seeing it pop up in other spots in town. I would love to see the first time I see it move outside of Carbondale to another, do the leapfrog to another community before I start saying things like, I'm going to preventatively treat, 100% of our ash trees. Cause it is at the end of the day, it's a pretty big decision on a bunch of different fronts. And I'm sure you guys probably feel similarly, although you're a little bit more under the gun to get things going, but.
Well, and that's why I said that we'll make our recommendations to the Board of Trustees in September.
Okay.
And Carl and the Director of Public Works will make their recommendations to the Board of Trustees, and then the Board of Trustees will act. We're an advisory board to the Board of Trustees concerning trees. We don't set policy. That's the Board of Trustees' responsibility. So that Carl will be at the forefront and our Director of Public Works of implementing any treatments and policies and stuff like that do with emerald ash borer.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. We have, looks like we have one more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Come on, Rob, you don't have to say.
I got to talk to Marty. My name's Rob Comey. I live here in Carbondale, and I really appreciate all the resources and all your backgrounds here. Like, there's a ton of resources in this room. A couple of quick questions on here. First, high value trees under 6 to 8 dBH. What's the recommendation at this point? Or what is the thought moving forward on those younger trees or smaller diameter trees?
I don't have a plan yet. We'll be working on it. Back when I worked for the city of Longmont, when it hit in Boulder County, smaller trees like that, they would start removing them, was a common practice. Chris can talk to his experience, but I don't know what we're going to do here yet exactly, but from my past experience.
I know I'm kind of throwing this as a bit of a dialogue, but the thing is that you have these younger trees that are vigorously growing, right? That's a good thing. They've got the irrigation. So why just, be like, hey, I don't even need a chainsaw. I can cut that down with a Sawzall, kind of a thing. Like, why take that approach? It seems like it's like this might be the cost benefit of, how much, what we can do here and for how long and for how many treatment cycles. Granted, the injectable, it doesn't seem like it would work here.
Yeah, I would agree with Carl. I saw it in Chicago a lot. I think there was a sense of urgency with how fast it spread in urban communities where it was like overnight. You were seeing entire neighborhoods lose all their ash trees. So people were, if they saw this tree that was young and it was easy to replace it with something similar size, they cut their losses. I certainly think it's going to be a decision that every individual homeowner is going to have to make for themselves. I think that there's a valiant effort to be made. There are arguments to be made of trying to save as many as possible, especially if they're considered a healthy, vigorous ash or a rare cultivar, for instance. I think for basalt, my intention is actually to begin by treating them all. And like I said, do a little bit of monitoring and observation just to see how fast it spreads, because there are really a lot of unknowns with how it's going to function in our valley versus how it's functioned everywhere up to the Front Range, because it's now left its native ash range. I think that kind of throws a little bit of a wrench into saying we can do exactly what Denver did or exactly what Chicago did or whatever. We're going to definitely have to chart our own path. And certainly that's worth thinking about is maybe it's worth saving these younger trees because, the pressure won't be there forever and we can count on that.
Sure. I think the thing here, though, the initial core of the question is treat how. If we're not going to use an injectable, what's the next way? We're trying to reduce the risk. We're trying to reduce impacts to off-site populations, to off-target species.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be a big concern of people in the community. When you can say, hey, we got a closed loop, boom, and we've got studies that show that the toxicity to insects far exceeds that to birds, to woodpeckers, and that the larvae desiccate in very short order so they don't become an attractant. Okay, so that's all good. But then, what about these other trees that just haven't just sized up yet?
For sure. I don't know that I have an exact answer for that yet.
How are you gonna deal with it, with stuff that's under 8 or 9 inches?
I intend to probably go through and choose what are poor quality that I frankly would probably be removing anyways,
Right.
and just accelerate that timeline. But for the ones that I'd like to treat, I'll probably end up relying on those soil probe injections.
Because you threw willets out there and that's a young population.
That's right. And I don't intend to cut down every ash tree in Willits because I think I'd have a riot, and I would probably riot myself because I live there.
Yeah.
But again, the goal of these management strategies is to manage that pace, right? Like
Yeah.
you're not, the intention is not to make a cut and dry decision that, oh, we're removing all these trees or, oh, we're treating all these trees. It's kind of going to have to play itself out a little bit and be ready to make a decision of, hey, it's going to take doing these treatments every year. Do we really want to keep doing that? Or does the town decide, we'd rather cut our losses because we don't want to introduce that particular pesticide in that quantity in our community?
Well, the thing in here, this is talking about decidedly a 3-year cycle, not 2-year. I mean, that's what's in here. It's in here. It quoted multiple, times that is believed to be.
Yeah, for the trunk injection
Yeah,
treatment, for sure.
Ivermectin that we can go to 3-year.
Yep. And that's
And
actually now that,
That's
that's-
Colorado State stamp on it. so-
yep. And certainly that is the new recommended interval after now 15, 20 years. I would still potentially be wary of that if it was a very high pressure of EAB. Frankly, I don't know that we'll ever see that sort of pressure in this valley. So we may have that opportunity to never really need to do the once every other year treatment cycles.
Yeah. Okay.
But there was also some allusion to it. We kind of broke it very simply down, like there's
You come from
chronic
the war
injections
zone,
and all that, right?
Yeah.
But there's not 100, there's a dozen different ways to do those trunk injections between the concentrations, the rate, the
Right.
size, the exact
Sure.
product, and that all is going to be decisions we're just going to have to make.
Got it. And then this is a total peripheral question, but since this affects all ash, do you know of any studies showing how how EAB affects single leaf ash, which is our native that grows out in the hardwood draws out on the
It won't.
EAB?
Yeah.
Well, no, it's not a single leaf ash.
Yeah, it's like the
Okay.
mountain ash. It's common name only.
Okay. Okay, this is not, I'm not talking mountain ash here. Okay, just,
Right.
okay,
Right.
all right. Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank everyone. We are a little bit past our time, but is there anybody with a burning question? I don't want to leave anybody out. We're gonna have, Go
I
ahead.
just had two things.
Yep.
If you go to Colorado Tree View, it shows our inventory for the town of Carbondale for all the trees in the public area, all species of trees. Just two things on the parks. Miners Park has about 11 ash trees or 10, and Sopris Park has about 10 or 11 trees too. So there are important trees to two of our main parks in town. So we're really going to be looking hard at those. And that's about it for me.
again, thank you so much to our presenters tonight. Oh,
Our next meeting is August 17th, where we'll be putting down our recommendations that go to the Board of Trustees in September. You're all invited to attend.
yeah, we are recruiting for the tree board also, so please don't hesitate if you're interested. Again, any other comments? I'd like to ask for a motion to adjourn then.
I'll move.
We have a motion to adjourn, a second. Okay, we've got a second. Thank you again very much for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Nice job.